Svitlana, you wrote a piece in The Spectator saying that overhyping the counteroffensive is not helpful. Why do you say that?
In a way, the endless talks about counteroffensive are the fault of the Ukrainian government, and the idea has been promoted by the president himself and downwards. And of course, it has been beneficial for Ukraine because the West supplied us with the modern tanks, our pilots are gonna get training, and in the future we will receive the F-16 fighter jets. But the problem is that now Ukraine alliance have so big expectations about the counteroffensive, and people start to ask, okay, it was promised to happen in spring, and where is the big push? So now Zelensky is trying to low down the expectation a bit as well of the many members of his team, because this high expectation now turn into a liability, and disappointing result could end up with the appetite eroding to continue funding Ukraine from our allies. That's why, and for many Ukrainian soldiers, it is also a sensitive topic, because they will be the ones who will fight, who will sacrifice their health and their lives, and they just ask everyone to shut up, don't give information to Ukraine's enemy, and just to wait. Because the past few weeks we could notice Ukraine preparing the ground for the battle with attacks on Russian fuel and weapon depots and command centers in occupied territories, as well as in Russia. Ukraine is using the drones and long-range missiles that it received from the United Kingdom, but nobody really knows when the counteroffensive will start. And I'm told that even Ukraine doesn't share this information with its allies because they're afraid that information can leak, and Russians will be even more prepared for it.
Well, I should imagine that at the centre of any counteroffensive has to be a surprise element. You want to catch your opponent unawares. But you mentioned something there that I just want to pick up on, Svitlana. Are you worried that if this counteroffensive is not successful or as successful as has been advertised, are you seriously worried that support from Western governments will start declining?
If the counteroffensive is successful, I'm sure that support will be even bigger to help Ukraine to end the war, and success, and what we mean under success, like liberating some territories, will show that Ukraine is actually capable of fighting and winning, as we showed last year in Kharkiv region and Kherson. But I'm really worried that if something goes wrong, it is a war, we can't predict anything, but if something goes wrong and Ukraine can't fulfill those expectations, maybe the West will start pushing Kyiv to negotiate with Russia. And it's, of course, not a good side for Kyiv and for Ukraine, and it's not what Ukrainians want. And that's why I think that some members of Ukrainian government are right about starting to stop overhyping the counteroffensive and saying, okay, it is just another step in the war, and it's not like the final move to achieve the victory as they were talking about it earlier.
Okay. Tim, in your role as a weapons analyst at intelligence company Janes, and of course the author of Little Green Men, the inside story of Russia's new military power, let's look at it from the Russians' perspective. Of course, what preparations have they been making, seeing as for a few months now we've been hearing about this counteroffensive? How are the Russians preparing?
Well, first of all, they've been digging in. They've created several lines of fortifications with bunkers and minefields and obstacles and trenches and bunkers for their weapons and stockpiling ammunition and positioning their reserves. So they are, it's the worst kept secret in the world that they're going to be attacked. So they've obviously been preparing for it. And also they've launched the offensive to capture Bakhmut, to inflict losses on the Ukrainians, to make them use up their ammunition reserves and undermine their morale at a key moment in time.
And Do you think that the object of the counteroffensive, a realistic object, is to push every single Russian soldier off Ukrainian territory?
Well, that's the war aim of Ukraine, but whether that is the objective of the offensive that you call the offensive, the current attack that might be underway in the next couple of weeks or months, that's probably only the first stage of any kind of offensive operation. I mean, we have to think in terms of this as of course, the real war where people are killed and stuff happens on the battlefield, and the war of the narratives. And both the Russians and the Ukrainians and the Western governments are trying to create perceptions of victory and defeat, and create the sort of impression of success and an impression that their opponents are being defeated. And we've seen it over the past week where we had the argument over the who occupied Bakhmut, and it went on for several days with President Zelensky denying the Russians had captured the place and the Russians producing video showing they had captured it. And that was the classic example of these war of narratives. And we also had the incursion by the Russian freedom fighters earlier this week near Belgorod, which again was an attempt to portray something that wasn't actually happening. I mean, it was obvious these people were supplied with American weapons by the Ukrainian armed forces. You could see that they were clearly American vehicles that they were driving, and they had American weapons, and they were driving from Ukraine. So the idea that this was nothing to do with the Ukrainian government is patently ridiculous. But it got some headlines, it got an impression, and that's what several of these military activities are about. They're not about actual real events. They're about creating an impression, a war of narratives.
Tim, what does this counteroffensive need in order to be successful? We've heard from Svitlana, who's saying, look, it's quite risky overhyping this counteroffensive, because if it fails, then that could have a knock-on consequence in the support for the Ukrainian effort. What does it need in order to be successful?
Well, obviously it has to capture some land or defeat some Russian units, but that's the mere tactical impact. They have to create a psychological disruption and defeat amongst the Russian elite. That's their objective. I've heard several Ukrainian military commanders and politicians talk about it. They want to deliver a kind of knockout blow that convinces the Russian military political elite that the war is doomed. And to do that, they have to create panic and confusion in a large number of Russian units, so they retreat in chaos or surrender or surrounded. Now, that's a big ask for the size of force that the Ukrainians have trained up and are ready to commit. They've got like 200 Western supplied tanks and probably 500-600 Western supplied armored vehicles and about 100 artillery pieces. Now that sounds a lot, but considering you're fighting in a front line that's 1,000 kilometers long, it's probably not enough to create an offensive that advances along the whole length of the front. It's only probably enough to do a small section to achieve a victory like we saw in Kyiv. But the problem for the Ukrainians and the West is that those tanks and those armored vehicles, it's taken 6 months to get them into place. And there's not a second wave of equipment coming. There's been no more announcements of tanks and armored vehicles. So this force is going to be committed. And even if they have a victory, they're going to take losses. They're going to suffer breakdowns, that some of the tanks are going to be knocked out. Some of them are going to get stuck in mud or whatever. So they're going to suffer attrition. So even if they succeed in getting that limited victory that gives them, captures a town or a district, by the end of it, they won't have the mass or the resources to do another offensive for a very long time. So that's why it's a one-shot offensive. And if they are at that point where they've advanced, captured something, they're vulnerable to a counterattack because they've exhausted their reserves and their supplies and their equipment's worn out. So it's not going to be over in a matter of weeks or months. And I think your colleague from Ukraine is right to say that this is not going to be a knockout blow that will turn the course of the war in a few weeks.